We complete Genesis 2 today with one of the most powerful, poignant, and historically wildly misread passages, not only in Genesis but in the whole Bible. And the consequences of biblical misinterpretation here are tremendous, especially for the relationships between humans by gender and also between humans and the earth. So let's just jump right into this story and pay attention to the original Hebrew and the cultural context so we can get past the destructive misinterpretations that have plagued us for so long. We finished last time on verse 17 up here with the commandment that God gave the Adam about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then we see there's no response. And I've been teaching long enough to know that I have a little slogan I tell myself: just because I've said it doesn't mean they've heard it. Every parent knows that when you talk to a child, and every teacher knows that just because the faces are out there doesn't mean they were actually listening and absorbing what you have to say. And in this case, you imagine that God would know that, and yet God's never spoken to a human before, so God doesn't have any pre-existing knowledge of this. And if that seems facetious, we'll see that the Yahweh's image and characterization of God, both in this chapter and elsewhere, is of God who's experimenting, of a God who's just seeing what happens. So if that goes against your theology of God, well, I won't be too surprised, but your theology of God is going to have to let go a little bit if you just want to hear what Genesis is saying when it portrays God. And just to underscore again, I'm not at all suggesting, and I don't think Genesis is suggesting, this is quote-unquote the real nature of God. Genesis isn't consistent itself between the P version that we saw in chapter 1 of a God who's up above and speaks things into being, and here a God who's down on the earth forming things into being directly. But obviously these writers knew that there were other books already in the scriptures of Israel, even if they weren't yet in something we call the Bible. And so they knew there were multiple pictures of this God as a character. And so that's what we have here, is one portrayal of God as a character. And this one is very hands-on. But not hands-on in terms of saying to the Adam, did you get that? You want to repeat that back to me, make sure you understand? Or leave in any questions? Rather, goes directly from that prohibition to the narrator's brief intervention here, then the Lord God said. But really it's continuous, of course. The only reason there's a need for this narratively is this is not spoken to the Adam, but plainly spoken to God's own self, because he's speaking about the Adam as if the Adam's not there. So let's see what happens here and what initiates this. After Genesis 1, and assuming that we read this as continuous with Genesis 1, again, that goes to the question of whether you think Genesis 2, 4b and following is from a different author, a different time. We've gotten into that before. I won't get into that now. But we as readers heard throughout Genesis 1, and God saw this that God had made, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, and now for the first time, not good. Lo tov in Hebrew. And it's not the only lo tov we have in this section. So pay attention to what's not, and the text will finish on a positive not, even though it starts on a negative not. So it's not good that the Adam should be alone. It's the first time we're hearing any concept of alone, the Hebrew word meaning apart here, used a number of times, which is implying something we wouldn't necessarily have known, which is that this Adam is alone or apart, both in the sense of it's the only one of its species, but there don't seem to be any other creatures here. And if we want to read it as consistent with Genesis 1, we have to say the earth is filled with creatures. Let's see what happens as we continue here. So God's first response is, I will make, and it should be it here, him a helper as his partner, which is not a good translation. It's half a good translation. Partner works, and maybe helper works alone, but what we don't hear, we're hearing that against the historical patriarchal interpretation that makes it sound like the woman who'll be made as a mere assistant. And that's not what's being named here. So let's look at the Hebrew, ezer kenegdo, a key term here. And it's repeated at the end of verse 20, and I'll come back to that in a second to show you the chiastic structure. Literally means help in front or opposite, or one might say a counterpart, or a partner. And we'll see how that literally help in front or back it plays out in terms of the rabbinical interpretation of this. So let's go back and see how this section here is shaped, 18 to 20, in a form of a chiasm. And although I have it in my notes there, you can see, I'll put it on the screen here so you can see it in the chiastic shape. So framed around it's not good, and the question of ezer kenegdo, and then the animals that come, and then in 19b, that God brought them to the Adam to see what to name them. So it sets these verses apart from the tree of knowledge before it, and from what God will do as a second attempt here, starting in verse 21. So we see here, and Kasuto. Well, I won't go to that point now. So out of the Adamah, Yahweh God formed, and this is recalling the forming of the human in the first place. So as God formed the Adam, now God is forming all the Hayat, all the living of the field. So field animals, as we saw Sadeh as field in verse 5, suggesting agricultural plants. Similarly here, this is implying domesticated animals. And as we know anthropologically, and recent work like from James Scott and others have really highlighted this, that the process of domestication was neither obvious nor quote-unquote natural, but a process that took thousands of years and may have been initiated as much by the animals as by the humans. Who needs who more, one could argue. But Genesis presents it differently, as God is making fresh these animals of the field. And Kasuto takes that as, well, these are separate species that were not made in the original creation. And you can take it that way if you like, if you want to make it consistent. But note what's being formed here as a potential ezer kenegdo, as a partner for humans. Cattle, field animals, and birds, which is just interesting. Why not other things? Why not reptiles? Why not fish? Why birds? Of course, in the flood story, the dove and the crow will be relevant for signs of ending the flood, but we don't know anything about that yet. And we'll see, curiously, that it doesn't match here what the Adam gave names to. Here there are two categories: the Haya of the Sadeh, the animals of the field and birds of the air, but here the Adam gives names to the Behema, which are part of what's narrated in chapter 1, and to the birds of the air and the animals of the field. And really, cattle here is misleading because animals of the field implies things like cattle, domesticated animals, oxen and cows and such. And so Behema suggests some wider category, and we see it's used a number of times in Genesis, whereas the generic term is not so much. But let's go back to where we were. That out of the ground Yahweh God made these and brought them to the Adam to see what he would call them. So as chapter 1 had God calling things day and night, etc., now that power of calling things, not of bringing them into being, but of calling things, is delegated to the human here. And notice it's suggesting that God doesn't know the answer. This is a God who doesn't have it all figured out and doesn't have all knowledge. God's waiting to see with a certain suspense of what the Adam will name them. And we don't hear the names. That's not narrated. But what we hear is what the point of the plot is that it's a failure. It is not a suitable helper. So although the Adam is given names to all these things, we see not found. So lo matzah matching the lo tov in verse 18. It's not good, and the ezer kenegdo is not found. So God has to try a plan B, which is surgery. And we see this starting here in verse 21. God is surgeon. The term for deep sleep, teredema, is a special term. It's not just an ordinary sleep. It's almost always a sleep directly imposed by God. It's divine anesthesia, as we see here. It'll come up in Genesis again in 15:12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness. But we'll get there when we get there. So now that God has anesthetized the Adam, and he's fully asleep, and he took one of his ribs, and tsela is the word in Hebrew, plura is the word in Greek, and that matters because in John's Gospel, it's the pleura of Jesus that is stabbed by the Roman centurion's sword. And so that brings forth blood and water, and one can argue that the scene there in John 19 is echoing this scene here. Just as this scene brings forth life, so Jesus stabbed by the Romans brings forth life. And the only other time that word is used refers to like the rib of the tabernacle. The holder of the holder of the tablets of the commandments. That's understood as also as the presence of God. And so we see in the early Midrash this wonderfully amusing Dr. Doolittle-like comment from Rabbi Samuel ben Naaman. When the Lord created Adam, and he has it as Adam here, he created him double-faced. Then he split him and made him of 2 backs, one back on this side and one back on the other side. To this is objected, parenthetically, my parenthetical, this is typical rabbinical fashion. A rabbi says something, another rabbi says something else, and it leads to a conclusion, sort of a dialectic here. To this is objected, but it is written, and he took one of his ribs, quoting our passage. As the rabbi explains, the Hebrew means one of his sides. He replied, and as you read, for the second side of the tabernacle, which is this passage here from Exodus 26, second side of the tabernacle. So it's suggesting 2 sides that are now separated, and we'll see how that works out. So took out one of the ribs and closed up its place with flesh. Nicely done, Yahweh. Good act of the first surgery, if we see here. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made. Again, notice the making here. Literally, it's build. This term is a different term for what we saw in terms of formed a couple of verses earlier here, where it said he formed every animal. Here, if I keep track of where I am here, made, which is to say built into a woman. And we're going to see the role of human building throughout Genesis as an ambiguous thing. Made into an Isha. So we as readers know it's an Isha before the Adam knows it's an Isha. And notice that totally lost in English, which as a woman and brought her to the man, is it's not the same in Hebrew, and that's central to what's going on here. So he made it into an Isha and brought her to the Adam, and now the Adam can see the Isha and responds. So then the Adam said, "This at last." And the phrase means finally, or about time, and we can see it here in the Hebrew. Let's see if I can find the words here. Here we have it. This is now, and we see it as now here. Hapapam, hapa'aham. Is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And that's a phrase that will define kinship throughout the Bible, not only in Genesis, but we see here also in Judges and Samuel, to share bone and flesh. Notice, again, this biblical notion, not the same soul or anything Greek and Platonic, and they're going to adapt it into Christianity much later, but bone and flesh as defining the commonality. And so now the Adam names what the narrator had already told us, that this one shall be called Isha, for out of Adam this one was taken. So the Adam is naming this counterpart, this Ezer Kenegdo, as Isha, and now he's an Ish as well. And the narrator then interjects with a little etymological explanation, which leads most scholars to argue this is coming from some other time, this is like inserted in here, or sometimes the other way around, that to explain a cultural phenomenon like this, a story is invented to explain it. We'll see another one like this after the Jacob wrestling scene way later, when it says this is why the Israelites don't eat the flesh that comes from the hip, if hip is the right term there, but we'll get there way later. But there's more going on here than just a simple etymological explanation. Suddenly, readers are injected into a world of mothers and fathers and partnerships. There was an Adam, and now there's an Ish and an Isha, but now we're in a world of the author's world, where there's fathers and mothers and spouses, although it's very important as to hear, Hebrew has no word for wife. Literally, it clings to his Isha, to his woman. So the Ish leaves his father and mother and clings to his Isha, and they become one flesh. And note, as many scholars have noted here, and you see it from Wenham down there below in my notes, this does not denote merely the sexual union or the children conceived in marriage. Rather, it affirms that just as blood relations are one's flesh and bone, so marriage creates a similar kinship relationship between man and wife. And as many have noted, it does not orient, as much later Christian theology does, this union toward procreation. It's oriented toward unity and intimacy. As we see in the next verse, they're naked and unashamed. So there's nothing about, and they will have children. Unlike in chapter 1, where the very first commandment to the humans is to have sex, be fruitful and multiply, which of course is how that happens, isn't it? Here, there's simply an explanation for why there is this intimacy between the man and the woman that overrides the intimacy between a person and their parents. And the word for clings here is a really nice one, davek. It's used a number of times here. And the Greek is also a nice one. It implies a deep intimacy here, and in a physical way, not just the emotional bond, but the physical bond of people, like in a deep embrace. And so our chapter concludes with what I note here is the high point of the Bible, certainly the high point of Genesis, because things will decline steadily after this. And curiously, the Adam and his Isha, hinting at the problem that's going to come, were both, or literally the two of them, and as Alter notes, the two comes in the Hebrew, just two words after one flesh, two naked, hinting at the division that will coming right up. And they're both arome, which is a wordplay we'll see in the next section. I'll point to it now, where the serpent was arum. So the man and the woman are arome, and the serpent is arum. We'll get there next time. But what we want to finish on is this key point. They're naked and not ashamed. Lo, Yitzu Shavsu here. Sorry, it's a good not. So it was not good that that the man was alone, the Adam was alone. Not found was a partner, but now not ashamed is a good lo. That they don't have shame is an important key. And as many scholars said, we can read that at multiple levels. One is at the level, these are children, like 3-year-olds and babies and infants who are naked and unashamed. Another is, this is authentic human intimacy of sexually mature people who don't have to play roles and don't have to hide behind fancy clothes or jewelry or makeup or anything else, but can simply be who they are. And that's why I think it's the high point of the Bible here, that God's intention is that these humans, created in the image and likeness of God, can see each other, we can see each other as we are, and see God in us. A biblical version of the Eastern sense of namaste, of the God in me sees and acknowledges the God in you. And so this is certainly the high point, where there's gender equality, physical intimacy, a lack of shame, the intimacy with God and with creation, and all is good except the not ashamed. But that will not last long. We'll see what happens next time. See you then.